In this lecture, we'll address popular music in the United States and the rise of rock, and then delve into the evolution of pop music. Pop, or popular music, is that is designed to appeal to a wide cross-section of the public, or to a sizable and easy-to-target demographic within a larger population. Pop music predates the Victrola, as a section of Broadway called Tin Pan Alley began selling sheet music for piano and other instruments in the late 1800s. The turn of the 20th century led to improvements in printing technology, and song publishers could easily mass-produce sheet music for a growing middle class. With the emergence of the phonograph and recorded music, sales of sheet music soared. At the same time, jazz music developed in New Orleans, an improvisational and mostly instrumental art form. Jazz absorbed and integrated African rhythms, blues, and gospel music. Swing jazz bands led by Louis Armstrong, Tommy Dorsey, and others dominated radio, recordings, and dance halls. By the 1930s, pop vocalists called crooners took center stage. Typically male, crooners like Rudy Vallee and Bing Crosby sang sentimental songs in a soft, low voice. Crosby would popularize Irving Berlin's White Christmas, one of the most recorded songs in history. Aided by radio, pop crooners like Frank Sinatra were among the first singers to win the hearts of a large national teenage audience. The migration of Southern blacks to northern cities in the first half of the 20th century brought popular music styles to new places. After the introduction of the electric guitar in the 1930s, blues-based urban black music by the likes of Robert Johnson, Bessie Smith, and Howlin' Wolf began to be marketed as rhythm and blues, or R&B, to set the stage for rock and roll's debut in the 1950s. Like many other industries at the time, the sound recording industry was segregated. While R&B music gained in popularity in the early 1950s, R&B record sales were tracked on their own race charts, separated from the white pop music charts. By 1955, R&B hits regularly crossed over from the race charts to the pop charts, although cover versions of their songs performed by white artists typically performed much better. For example, Pat Boone's version of Ain't That a Shame was #1 on the top 40 pop charts for 20 weeks. The original, and much better, song by Fats Domino only made it to #10. Black artists received little recognition or money for their music. White performers like Elvis Presley often received co-writing credits on songs they covered, despite not actually having written them. History.com explains an unfortunate truth of the time. It was easier to exploit and underpay black artists than white ones. Recording rights were purchased along with the recording. Others were recorded without contracts at all, meaning they were not entitled to any royalties. In just one example, Bessie Smith made millions for Columbia, but never received any royalties. A turning point, however, came in 1962 when Ray Charles recorded the country song I Can't Stop Loving You by the Grand Ole Opry's Don Gibson, marking the first time a black artist covering a white artist's song became a #1 pop music hit. A rise in juvenile delinquency coincided with a rise in the popularity of rock and roll. A number of factors could be to blame, including parental neglect, a rising consumer culture, and a burgeoning youth population following World War II. But it was easier to blame rock and roll. In the early 1960s, the FCC started banning certain songs that dealt with sexuality and violence, along with drug use, anti-war sentiment, class consciousness, and racism. That led to a wave of self-censorship, where rather than risk running afoul of the federal government, the recording industry introduced a new line of clean-cut white singers like Frankie Avalon and Leslie Gore to lessen rock music's harsh reputation. Just for fun, let's look at some of those banned songs. Van Morrison's Brown Eyed Girl includes the line "Makin' Love in the Green Grass," to make it one of the many songs banned for being too sexy for the 1960s. God Only Knows by the Beach Boys was considered blasphemous. If you've ever heard Louie Louie by the Kingsmen, you know its lyrics are largely undecipherable. The song was even investigated by the FBI because of its supposed obscene lyrics. One of my favorite bands, The Doors, has a twofer. Their song Light My Fire was banned for the line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," that insinuated drug use. Meanwhile, Unknown Soldier was nixed for its anti-war theme. Finally, while The Who's My Generation was allowed to blatantly disrespect its elders, Roger Daltrey's stuttering delivery was deemed too offensive and banned by the BBC. The boundary between black and white was just one of those blurred by rock and roll. Remember the high and low culture skyscraper from Chapter 1? Rock and roll challenged its low culture designation, first through its lyrics and then with its innovative performance styles. Chuck Berry's 1956 song Roll Over Beethoven merged rock and high culture with its references to classical music. Rock and roll was the first pop music genre to overtly challenge gender and sexuality norms. One such example is Little Richard, who wore a pompadour hairstyle, decorative makeup, and feminized costumes during his performances. Rock and roll blended cultural borders between white country and western music and black urban rhythms. Early white rockers, such as Buddy Holly and Carl Perkins, combined country, southern gospel, and Mississippi Delta blues to form a new sound called rockabilly. R&B hits would routinely cross over from the race charts, although, as already mentioned, covers by white artists were typically more popular than the originals. There were also white artists like Elvis Presley being encouraged by record producers to sound black, while some black artists like Chuck Berry were criticized by both black R&B artists and conservative white critics for sounding white. Notice the difference in how Berry was treated compared to Presley. Rock and roll also worked to mix northern and southern influences. As blacks migrated north in the early 20th century, they brought with them their love of blues and R&B. Northern musicians and audiences began embracing the blues, while Buddy Holly and Carl Perkins brought their southern rockabilly to northern listeners. 1950s rock music also blurred the sacred and the secular. Some artists, like Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard, had strong religious upbringings, but still succumbed to pressure that they were playing the devil's music and stopped for a time. In modern times, some churches use rock music to appeal to youth, while Christian-themed bands show up in unlikely genres, like heavy metal. Attempts to tame rock and roll in the 1960s led American teenagers to look for edgier content in England. In the early part of the decade, American performers regularly charted overseas, but no British bands had appeared in any American top 10 pop list. That changed in 1964, when a mop-topped quartet from Liverpool brought their soft, melodic sound to America to launch the British invasion. The work of the Beatles would eventually inspire new musical genres like power pop, pop rock, new wave, and alternative rock. Fellow countrymen, the Rolling Stones, offered a much different style, emphasizing gritty, chord-driven, high-volume rock that would influence the bands who would create glam rock, hard rock, punk, heavy metal, and grunge music. Back in the United States, black artists began mixing older R&B, pop, and early rock into a new style called soul. The style became known after one of its most prominent record label, Detroit's Motown, and included such performers as Marvin Gaye and the Supremes. Featuring vocalist Diana Ross, the Supremes had 12 #1 singles in 5 years, and showed Motown producers that songs emphasizing romance and featuring a danceable beat were more popular with white audiences than songs about social rebellion and political upheaval. By the late 1960s, Many songwriters and performers spoke to their generation's social and political concerns through two music genres, folk and psychedelic rock. Folk music has long served as a voice for social activism, and artists like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez use their music to protest poverty, racism, and war. With its rough edges and amateur quality, folk is considered a democratic and participatory music form. As recreational drug use increased, rock musicians began to experiment with and sing about drugs in rock's psychedelic era. Performers like Jefferson Airplane and Jimi Hendrix believed they could enhance their artistic capability by taking mind-altering drugs like LSD, and saw the use of drugs as a form of personal expression and an appropriate response to government inaction on issues like racism and American involvement in the Vietnam War. As rock and roll moved from the edges of the American music scene into the mainstream, other genres arose to take its place on the fringes. The counterculture of the 1960s had become the consumer culture of the 1970s. Critic Ken Tucker called this faceless rock. Bands with, quote, no established individual personalities outside their own large but essentially discrete audiences, unquote, of young white males. These bands, which include the likes of Boston, Styx, and Journey, filled stadiums to entertain the maximum number of people while generating the minimum amount of controversy. Punk rock arose in the late 1970s to revive rock's basic defining characteristics: simple chord structures that anyone with a few guitar lessons could master, catchy melodies, and politically or socially defiant lyrics. Emerging in New York City with bands like the Ramones and the Talking Heads, punk quickly spread to England, where a soaring unemployment rate and growing class inequality ensured the success of socially critical rock from the likes of the Sex Pistols, considered one of the most controversial groups in rock history. Punk did not achieve commercial success in the U.S., partly because it was so openly hostile toward the commercialization of the mainstream music industry. What it did do, however, was break down the boys' club mentality of rock with unapologetic and unadorned frontwomen like Patti Smith, Joan Jett, Debbie Harry, and Chrissie Hynde. Punk music introduced all-female bands whose members not only wrote but performed their own music. In short, punk brought experimentation back to the music industry. Independent-minded, or indie rock, usually distributed by smaller record labels, followed punk in the 1980s with its DIY approach. Bands like R.E.M., The Cure, and Sonic Youth found audiences through live shows and on alternative format college radio stations. In the Pacific Northwest, the indie subgenre grunge emerged, taking the spirit of punk and infusing it with more attention to melody. Grunge broke into the American mainstream with Nirvana's Smelled Like Teen Spirit from the 1991 album Nevermind, establishing an audience for other grunge bands like Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam. The cruel irony of indie music is that mainstream attention can cause a band to lose its indie status. Still, independent acts like Arcade Fire and one of my favorites, Vampire Weekend, are among many that have launched and sustained successful recording careers built on independent labels. One of the most prominent indie labels is Durham's Merge Records, which has released music from Arcade Fire, along with Spoon, She and Him, and Neutral Milk Hotel. With the dominance of mainstream rock by white male performers, the place of black artists in the rock world diminished from the late 1970s onward. This trend, coupled with the creation of danceable disco music, created a space for a new sound to emerge. Similar to punk's opposition to commercial rock, hip-hop music stood in direct opposition to the polished, professional, and often less political world of soul. Its combination of social politics and confrontational lyrics carried forward long-standing traditions in blues, R&B, and rock. Hip-hop's first major success was the 1979 song Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang. By the mid-1980s, hip-hop had exploded as a popular genre with commercial success with groups like Run DMC, whose 1986 album Raising Hell was the first #1 hip-hop album on the pop charts. But because most major labels and many black radio stations rejected the rawness of hip-hop, the music spawned hundreds of new independent labels. Initially dominated by male performers, hip-hop was open to women, and artists like Salt and Peppa and Queen Latifah quickly became major players. Hip-hop has been praised for providing a forum for debate on issues like gender, class, sexuality, violence, and drug use, while at the same time criticized for lyrics that promote misogyny, homophobia, and violence. The subgenre gangsta rap has been especially accused of inciting violence, with songs like 1992's Cop Killer by rapper Ice-T and his thrash metal band Body Count, and NWA's 1998 release, The Police. Another item for debate in hip-hop is the place of white artists like Eminem, the Beastie Boys, and Action Bronson. Some critics reference back to the 1950s, where white artists cover the songs of black musicians with greater success, and claim white hip-hop performers are engaging in the same cultural appropriation. By 2017, hip-hop and R&B surpassed rock to become the top music genres in the United States, with the majority of the top songs and albums coming from the genre. Finally, country music has been a popular and profitable section of the sound recording industry since the early days of pop. The genre itself has evolved over the years, but still shares one defining characteristic: the country voice, inflected by a twang or a drawl. The so-called Nashville sound originated in the 1950s as a more polished version of the rough honky-tonk music of Jimmie Rodgers and Hank Williams Sr., borrowing smooth elements from pop music like string sections, background vocals, and crooning lead vocalists like Patsy Cline and Jim Reeves. By the 1970s, country music saw a division between two factions. The first was pop country, where pop music singers like John Denver and Olivia Newton-John began having hits on the country charts. Country singers like Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton began having both country and pop hits, bringing more mainstream acceptance to the country genre. In opposition to pop country and the Nashville sound was outlaw country, an edgier form that re-emphasized honky-tonk and rockabilly elements and was popularized by Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, and Waylon Jennings.